Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard here for your weekly dose of tournament tier list action for Legends of Runeterra fans. Now, I want to start this off by saying that as far as I'm aware, there are no large open tournaments happening this weekend, so this list is a little bit inconsequential. There's no real stakes here. So rather than go over lineups and in-depth analysis, I'm really just kind of going to go over the meta as a whole as I see it right now, let you know what I picked up on last week, where I think we stand now, where we might be next week, because we're a couple weeks off of our balance patch. It should be happening 4 weeks after the set drops. I believe this is like we're going into the third week, so I think we're like a week and a half away from our balance patch that should lead us into the seasonal, and after that things are going to be taken more seriously. But right now, bit of a lull week. We'll have an online league series next week, but as far as I can tell, nothing major happening this weekend. So the first thing I want to touch on is Bard Galio, which last week I was pretty adamant about putting in tier 1, and it performed to my expectation. It took first and second place at the online league series, with the tournament actually being decided by a Bard Galio mirror match in game 3 of the finals, which I thought was really interesting, and despite this, I moved it down to tier 2. Part of the reason for this is that because this is a weekly updated tier list, I am fine taking it week by week and saying like, hey, this deck is like, it's tier 1 on the opening weekend, and it'll probably fall off after that, but I should have it in tier 1 for the opening weekend. I'm not like calling my shots for the entire meta at a time. I'm calling it on a week by week basis. And like last week, I thought Bard Galio was very well positioned. This week, I'm not as confident about it, and things of that nature are going to happen from time to time, but it definitely looks pretty weird if you like, I put it in tier 1, it wins a tournament and gets second place, and then I move it down a tier for the next week. So it's really just kind of where I think the meta is sort of settling out, and that's on proactivity. Not that Bard Galio isn't proactive, this is sort of a separate point. But the decks that I'm currently feeling are tier 1. Last week was like Pantheon, Aphelios, Thralls, and Bard Galio. Now it is Pantheon, Viego, Thralls, and the Rubin pile. Now, Pantheon has taken a little bit of a hit recently in popularity, and its ladder stats are actually below 50% win rate at the moment, and in like in tournament, in the fight nights that we're seeing, not super popular. This could just be players getting a little bit bored of the deck, wanting to try new things. It's kind of hard to say. Again, low stakes environment, but I still think Pantheon's a very solid tournament choice. I think that this will ramp back up for the seasonal. I'm a little bit worried that its lull in popularity has like made it dodge some nerfs. Hopefully not. We'll see in, I guess, a week and a half, but that is where we are sitting on Pantheon Yumi right now. I still think it's a very popular, or should be popular rather, but a very powerful deck that will remain in tier 1. Viego is moving up because it's just one of the most threat-dense decks we've ever had in Runeterra. Between the Deserter, the Viego, the Invasive Hydrovine, and then if you choose to run it something like the Tomb that can revive your largest dead unit, which 9 times out of 10 is going to end up being the Legion Deserter, I just think Viego's in an extremely good spot. Now, the Noxus variant is the one that a lot of players are more focused on. It doesn't have access to, deny or right of negation, and so I still think the Shurima version is a totally viable option, probably almost just as good, if not, because people that are looking to leave Viego up are like, okay, I can deal with the threats in a cadence where I can still put out enough pressure. Like I can deal with your 1 unit and then also put like 2 units on board, and then deal with your next unit and like put another unit on board. And then like I don't necessarily have to deal with the third one because I've done a good job of like winning around you so far, and I can just kind of whittle you down because there's really not a lot of healing in the Shadow Isle and Noxus variant of the deck. So when you move over to something like Shurima, decks that are looking to beat this deck by removing the singular threat and then going a little bit wider are not going to deal with the Shurima variant as well, because you have Red of Negation and Ancient Hourglass in order to actually protect your units. So that's kind of where I'm sitting on Viego. I think the deck is very well positioned. It's one of the pillars of the meta. People that are coming to tournaments with anti-lineups are like looking to pick on Viego and similar decks. But overall, the deck is still very well positioned. It is still winning tournaments despite the sort of counterplay that players are looking to get into it. Thralls, it's just, when Thralls pop off, they pop off, and there's not a whole lot that a lot of decks can do about that. The popularity of Thralls isn't really matching where I think it should be. I think this deck should be a lot more popular. I don't see it catching any nerfs heading into the balance patch, so I think Thralls will be like an excellent choice when we look towards the seasonal tournament. That's in about a month, a little bit more than that. But in the meantime, I'm probably going to keep Thralls in tier 1, even if they're not like showing up in the way that I would expect them to. Maybe I'll talk with some of the Thralls players or like try it myself and kind of just see where it goes, but I'm still pretty big on Thralls. I know that there are like decks that beat it, but I don't think you're really going to see anyone coming in like trying to pick on Thralls and having success with that even against the Thralls deck. And then the Rubin pile has skyrocketed in popularity recently, which makes sense. When you talk about things like Viego and Pantheon being these similar-ish playstyles where the idea is if I want to beat you, like I remove your big unit and then I play a unit, and then I remove your big unit and then I play a unit, and eventually I'm just kind of like a little bit wider than you are and I start to win the game around you. That doesn't really work against the Reuben pile. Because you cannot just remove one big unit, because I am also going wide, and I'm going wide with self-replacing cards. And then the idea is that eventually I'm going to drop a Winding Light, because that is the win condition that players are going towards more so than the Submersible of old. So just go wide on board, create value, Winding Light to finish you off. And that is something that like Vengeance decks or Disintegrate decks are not going to deal with particularly well, because you don't want to use removal on my Solari Priestess, because it already replaced itself. And then if that Solari Priestess generated a Traveler, then not only is that hard to remove with your removal tools, but also it also generated a card, and things just kind of snowball from there. So Reuben Pile is very good at... Reuben Pile is a lot like Bandle Tree was, where it's very good at gumming up the board and then sort of randomly winning the game off of that. Bandle Tree used to do it by just like eventually dropping the tree, and it's like, yeah, I've gummed up the board with 10 different regions, yahoo, or you cannot kill me before this 8 out of 10 tree like gives me my other 2 units. Reuben Pile is just operating along a similar vein, where like it's proactive enough, it's playing differently enough from other top decks that it's just in a very well position at the moment. So yeah, that is our tier 1. Before I move into tier 2, I do want to touch on something that I've noticed in Noxus Control, and that is players sort of moving a little bit away from Disintegrate and towards Scorched Earth, and it's an understandable adaptation. Like, obviously Disintegrate's broken, but you will find yourself in a situation where, like, you have Disintegrate and Ravenous Flock in hand, and it's like, okay, you know, if I have to use my units to get damage onto things anyway, then, like, I could either Disintegrate it and block it, or, like, I could just block it and flock it, and the Scorched Earth is just helping you deal with, like, very large units in a manner where, like, the Disintegrate isn't getting counterplayed. For example, what I mean by this, because that was probably confusing wording, I attack with a Spiderling, right? And you block with a Legion Deserter. If I Disintegrate the Legion Deserter, you could, like, Vile Feast my Spiderling, and all of a sudden, you know, I'm up Shit's Creek. If I just let the block happen and then Scorched Earth it, because Flock isn't going to kill it, that's kind of what we're looking for as players move more towards Scorched Earth, on top of the fact that, like, there's just a lot of landmarks running around. Not even necessarily landmark decks like Thralls, but there's just a decent amount of landmarks, even like the Tomb in the Viego deck. Players just do not want to get stuck without any landmark removal in their deck, and it can help slow down Thralls to a point where you can potentially squeak out a win against them. But yeah, that is just something that I wanted to shout out that I've noticed a lot of players doing, is like, if you see like people moving away from Disintegrate and towards Scorched Earth, it's mostly for reasons like that, like these large units that cannot be flocked, but decks that have answers to if you try to do a cheeky block Disintegrate play. That's why we're seeing Scorched Earth. I don't want to talk about tier 2 too much. This is going to be a shorter tournament tactician, but some of the big updates is, like, 1, I moved down the Alawi Ionia. Not as big on this deck as I was previously. I just don't see Alawi being a mainstay meta contender in her current form. I just don't think... Not that I think that Alawi and her package are bad, I just don't think they fit this meta particularly well. This meta is rather control-heavy outside of the proactive mid-range decks like Viego, Thralls, Reuben Pile, stuff like that. Like, you're getting a few different control decks that are performing pretty well. And so, like, Sundisk is coming back in a big way, because one of the things that we're looking at is, like, okay, you have these Noxus control decks that are looking to beat the proactive mid-range decks, and then there are players that are like, okay, I can go later than the Noxus mid-range deck, and that's where, like, Jace Heimerdinger is picking up traction. Is like, okay, you know, I can just out-late game the Viego deck while still being one of the more proactive control decks, because I have the Jace spells that I want to be playing, I have the factory workers that I want to be assembling, I have Heimerdinger that I can throw down, and, like, I still have proactive plays while more or less being a control deck, and that's why something like Field of Rush has fallen off a bit. They don't really have as many proactive plays in the mid-game. So Sundisk is just coming back as something that is going to sort of outperform these control decks that are all having a dick measuring contest, where, like, Viego's like, oh, you can't out late game me, I have Legion Deserters at Tombs, and then Jace Heimer's like, oh, all I need to do is veg at you and stick a Heimerdinger at the game is over. And Sundisk is just having a field day on all of those, more or less. So moving it up from the filler tier up until tier 2. Alawi has moved out of tier 1 and tier 2, just not in love with her position in the meta. I think the Bilgewater spells just are not doing what you need them to do. Tentacle Smash is not killing enough things. And you're just going to get beat by most control decks, because they only really need to deal with either the Alawi or the Tentacle if it has Overwhelm. You're not really forking them in the way that something like Pantheon is, where they have, like, you know, they have this big Wounded White Flame, and then they just, like, throw down a Pantheon next to it and Pale Cascade it. And it's like, well, actually, Pantheon, while it's not as big as the Wounded White Flame, does have enough keywords to make me care about it. The Alawi Tentacle dichotomy is just not really working out in a similar sense. And as, like, Aphelios has also moved down a little bit. Voltron decks are doing okay, better than you kind of expect them to, as I find myself saying for, like, the 3rd meta in a row. But I do think that, like, Riven Fizz is the better Fizz deck at the moment, surprisingly. It just kind of is how everything is shaking out. It's just dealing with these things a little bit better than the Aphelios. And I don't know if that's just players not as well equipped at dealing with the Riven Fizz, but this is the one that is performing more consistently in tournaments right now than the Aphelios, the one that players are choosing to bring over the previous Titan of the meta. And this isn't necessarily unforeseen, given the drastic drop-off of Aphelios' Swiss seasonal performance to its top cut seasonal performance, where it went from the most played deck to like the 5th most played deck. It was I believe the biggest drop off we've ever seen from Swiss rounds to top 32. And as we continue to really only have like fight nights to look at this more narrow space like the top 32 is, players are just a little bit too worried about bringing something like the Aphelios. But that is pretty much all I want to touch on. Like I said, a little bit of an inconsequential week. I'll have some more tournament stuff for you next week when we get back into the online league series. But that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Boulevard. I hope you got something out of this, and good luck in your tournaments.